audience members, welcome. Take a look at your identities in your blanket of life. Is there identity that changed in your lifetime? Were you born normalized dominant identity like able-bodied, but in your lifetime, you are now a person with a disability? How does that affect our journey? What feelings does that bring up? What experience is different than if you hold an identity the same your entire life? Join us today and let's discuss it.
I am overjoyed. Now, first of all, I'm overjoyed because that's just who I am. But today, y'all know what happened to that question with Jody. But before I do, I don't even know if I'm answering the question today, but I want to make sure that we introduce John Shank today on our show. When I say the last time he was with us, it was fire, okay? When I say I found out that he actually has had all 18 normalized dominant identities, it blew me away. But the conversation because of it was so rich. So again, I'm so excited to have him on the show today. Welcome to the show, John Shank. Thank you so much for spending your time again with us today.
Thank you, Nita, and I appreciate your comments. It was definitely a learning experience for me. For those of you who may not have heard my introduction before, I'll do a short brief of it, but I am an educator by profession. I'm an elementary trained teacher. I have experience as a building principal. I have central office experience in curriculum and professional development. I have a master's degree, all those things that are achievement based, I've got to tell you. And I also worked in an educational tech firm, and I was a chief of staff in those kind of business things. And that's kind of my achievement introduction. But I'd also like to just summarize a little bit more of a relational kind of an introduction. I by luck of birth, I have all 18 of those dominant, normalized dominant traits or threads. And part of that comes from a great uncle. My father was one of 5 boys. He was born in 1912. My grandfather was a farmer. 5 boys on a farm in the 20s. That's like heaven. That's like having a built-in workforce. And my grandfather was not a big educator person. He wanted the boys to stay home. My great uncle said, though, he was a chemical engineer for a tire company in Ohio. And he said education's important. And when my dad was 18, he made a deal with my dad. He said, I'll tell you what, if I will pay for your college education, if you will make the promise to pay for your brothers, and if that brother will make the promise to pay for the next one and roll it down. And so that's what happened. And because of that, myself, my 17 cousins, we all benefited. We all became second generation college educated individuals, which made a huge impact. I know it made a huge impact on mine. I can only assume it was very helpful to my cousins also. So that kind of experience and family bonding was very important to me.
That's so special.
As I stated in the previous episode, because we have John for a couple episodes, is I do trainings with judicial systems throughout the United States. And Ohio Supreme Court, I worked with and trained a lot of judges in Ohio. And so I met Judge Ballinger, which is John's wife. And over time became friends with her and therefore met John. And John is one of the people on my journey that has really helped me understand the experience of having 18 normalized dominant identities. And we've had some rich conversations because I don't have all 18 normalized dominant. And so like, oh, I didn't look at it that way. And you're kidding, you experienced it that way. But also you've had identities change in your lifetime.
Wow. So listen, John, this is the episode where I would love for you to share more with our audience around how some of those, because I understand some of those, or some of the 18 normalized dominant identities have changed. And so would love to hear what you're thinking. Like how has that happened?
Yeah. How did that happen?
Right. Yeah.
How did that happen?
That's the question. He wants answers from somebody. Dang it, yes.
Yeah. Well, as I reflect, as you asked me to think about this, I think there's three that I can identify that have gone from up to down. Certainly one of them, I think the age range is 18 to 65.
Yeah.
Well, I passed that 5 years ago.
Yeah.
So,
Wow.
And I would like to point out, listeners, go back. Now, listen, this is part 2 with John. Listen to part 1, because he never said he's 70. The entire time he's like, well, 67, 60. So now I hear that's 5 years ago. So now I hear that you are the 70.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So apparently part of the experience is admitting that.
I'm trying to hang on.
Yeah, okay.
I'm trying to hang on.
And I just hitting your fingers while you try to hang.
Well, you look 57. How about that?
There you
it
go.
is. There it is.
Well, 70's the new 50.
There you go.
No, so that's one, and
Yes,
we'll talk.
age.
I'll talk more about what
Yep.
that means because there's an aging factor, and I have some stories. The other one is I'm retired, which not necessarily unemployed. I have a pension. I get that, but when you're employed, it is part of your identity.
In America,
Yeah.
it absolutely.
wow.
It gives you certainly. It helped me feel heard
Yes.
when I was employed in the positions I was in.
That's interesting.
And I'll try to come back to that. And then probably the most significant for me is the able-bodied triangle with age and body. But one of the things that have really affected me is my hearing has decreased. And certainly I have hearing aids, and I make people aware of that. But that one has been the one that has caused me to have to adapt the most. But an example being, I'm getting ready to come out here for this. I live in Ohio, and I'm packing, and I've got wrist things that I wear at night for carpal tunnel so my hands don't go numb. I have a set of special drops and a whole procedure that I have to go to keep my dry eyes from causing me so I can't see. And then certainly I have my hearing aids. I have the set that I have in now, which are new ones, but I also have my old set in case anything would happen to these, because I live in constant fear of losing it. This is an old adage, but when you lose your sight, you kind of lose track of things. When you lose your hearing, you lose relationships because it takes you out of the conversation.
Oh, wow.
So
Wow.
and an example of that is I used to consult and do some things, and as a consultant, part of it is to keep the flow and ask good questions and put tables with heads together, and they're talking, and then you float the room and you listen, and you're picking up things that you are going to use as you do the next section of the presentation. I can't hear those conversations anymore, which has caused me to totally back off of that sense of loss. But then part of it is, I'm kind of ready. My wife and I travel some, and but again, that may be an excuse just so I have to face that loss.
Yeah, that when you shared that with me, because I can, I present and I always walk a room. I always tell a room, hey, I know what I'm doing the first hour, but then as the room talks at their tables, they'll determine where we go. And then when John said, I couldn't hear the conversation anymore, and so I stopped doing presentations, when you said that, I kind of like, that made me kind of take a step back. Like, why just because you can't hear it? Like, number one, I didn't think of that. I'm like, wow, how important my hearing is. And as an able-bodied person regarding my hearing, I didn't relate how important that is to my job, And so then when you lost that, I was like, oh, yeah, I didn't even think that that's something I needed to do my job, but it is. But then your response to, well, I couldn't hear them anymore, so I stopped. That kind of took me aback. So it took me aback just gaining awareness of the benefit I have of hearing and how important it is to my job. But then also that you were just like, because in my head, I'm like, well, just adjust. I mean, can you kind of, ask them, or you know what I mean? But I also hear you didn't adjust. Part of that is maybe because you're in retirement age and you don't have to. But then also part of it is maybe you're not as used to adjusting too, when you have 18 normalized dominant. So it's like, no.
Sure. Sure. And if you've got a good adjustment, I'd love to hear it. Yeah. I mean, I guess I could put speakers on the table, but it just didn't flow for me.
Yes.
And flow was important to be able to pick it up and go with it and that kind of stuff. So, and I think maybe I was ready to.
Yes,
I mean,
absolutely.
I'm just ready. And then as you age, not only do you have to have all these devices and crap you have to carry with you when you do stuff, but your body gets a little weaker, and I don't want to admit that, but I will say I was on vacation this past week with some of my family, and we're walking, and we're going down this little. We're going to a point over the water, and there's a little dip. I mean, it's just a ditch, but it was down a pretty steep hill, and then it comes up. And I'm getting ready to pop down it, and the people are looking at me and say, "Are you okay doing that?" What do you mean? Am I okay? And they're on my side, and I love them, and they're caring about me, and they're on my sides. And it was like, wow, that's a new experience.
Yeah. So when you're seen, it's in a deficit way.
But
you know what I mean? In that moment.
At that particular moment.
It's
and it was out of caring, and they
absolutely.
didn't want me to fall down in the ditch. I get it. I get it.
But for someone,
it was a new experience.
I was going to say, for someone who's 18 normalized dominant and has always been able to go when you want to go, I bet you that was made you take a step back.
And in my mind, this was not an issue. Of course, I ran down and my God, I'm not falling. I'm telling you that right now. But that's just an example of and looking at and accepting help from people,
right?
But another thing, I don't go up on ladders anymore. I don't start lifting. So those things are kind of changing, but it's like the hearing when you talked about adapting, and the fact that I have to adapt causes anger.
Yeah,
I think it goes frustration and then anger.
Yeah,
and I think that sometimes gets misperceived. I like to play pickleball, and I play very early in the morning. And I said I have this routine with my eyes. I just have naturally dry eyes, and I have to do all this stuff to keep it going. And sometimes I just can't see like I used to.
Yeah.
And you just can't. You hit the shot that you and I can feel myself, the frustration and anger, and I'm wondering how the people around me are perceived. What's he angry about? I'm not angry with anybody. But I'm angry that I'm in the situation and it's not working the way it used to.
That you can't do it like you used to.
And I can't do it like I used to.
And John, when in our conversations, this is something that John taught me that is a new understanding, and that new understanding has definitely built my capacity to really show up different and listen better, is that if you've experienced being able to do it, like in that example, and now you can't, the frustration that comes, the anger, but then also, and I'm going to use my word, you never use this, the vulnerability. You've talked about fear. Is like, I can't handle what I used to be able to handle.
I've got a story on that.
Well, go ahead. But that gave me, so go ahead and tell your story, because I don't want to ruin it. But that gave me such different insight, because sometimes I'm like, some men that I interact with, like you, with all 18 up, and they're your age, I will, remember different episodes, audience, we see a behavior outside of our experience. What do? Label it. I'll be like, old curmudgeony men. Like, what do they got to be angry about? Like, I'm judging them because I'm seeing them maybe get angry on the pickleball court, or, not take, when someone wants to help them, not take that and get defensive. You gave me a different way to look at that. Yeah. So tell us some of your stories about.
You mentioned in the introductions that my wife's a judge, and she's a municipal court judge, which is in Ohio. That's the lower level offenses. But one night about 1 o'clock in the morning, somebody's ringing the doorbell. Okay. Which is odd.
Yeah.
And she looks out our camera to look, and we only had one camera at that time, just the one on the door.
I bet they got more now.
And she recognizes, well, actually, I don't think she did. I think the person left, and then she called the police, and the police began to search it out, and they found out who the guy. They Googled our address, which we thought was impossible to do at the time, and a taxi driver, or some driver, brought the person to the house based upon a Googled address, and it was a person that she was aware of, and of course oh, Terry, this is okay. I got my bat beside the bed. This is no problem. What are you worried about? Blah, blah, blah. And then she pulls up a picture. And the person's 6'4", well beyond my capability to handle, I'm pretty sure.
Right.
And I go, ooh, that's a problem.
Yeah, maybe my baseball bat and my body aren't going to take
Because I was pretty sure he could take it away from me.
right.
You know.
Yeah.
So that just changed. You're right. Security cameras go up, lights all over the house, and
Now, yeah,
I'm not a gun person.
right.
Okay, it's not a hobby of mine. I
Yep.
respect other people who want to do that, but it's
Yeah.
not my thing. But when my wife got with the police department and concealed carry came up. I mean, I had gone through the concealed carry training with my son just because it was something he wanted to do, but I didn't. I did not purchase a gun. That was not it. But we went through that experience, and then I can tell you, my wife, when she was doing it, I'm pretty sure I wasn't there, but I think she was in tears when she was going through the qualification piece to be able to carry. Back in Ohio, when you had to have that kind of thing to go through, at least be trained, and so we have a gun in the house. It's never been out of the little lock box, but it's. I guess
Well,
it makes me feel a little more secure.
Absolutely.
You know,
this is the best story to start with because my father is 70 and he carries his everywhere with him. Like I'll come home, like I'm from Omaha, Nebraska, so he's in Nebraska, and I'll slide up on him. I never tell him when I'm coming home. I just because I got the code to the garage, you know what I'm saying? I got, I can get in.
Right.
And normally he'll be laying in his chair, and my thing is, I hope this man don't think I'm somebody because he keeps it in his, like where he's at in his chair. And I'm like, Dad, stop it. Like, but at the same time, he's older, right?
Yeah.
And he always says the worst feeling that he can have is not being able to protect the people that he loves.
Ain't that something?
And I can't fight that, because I want to be protected. So,
Right.
It's just interesting that you bring that up because in my mind, my dad can protect me without it. You know what I'm saying? Not thinking that he is older.
That some of his triangles are changing. That's bringing up that fear.
Exactly.
And John and
the
I
vulnerability.
The vulnerability.
And that's,
Because
I certainly don't want to admit that I'm vulnerable, but that's certainly it.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I brought that word real gentle. Yeah,
you did.
But John and I were friends while this was going on, while we were processing it, and you just brought that to light to me, like, oh, because males many times in our, being normalized dominant are seen and heard, and then are told, you're supposed to be some level of protector at some, and so then all of a sudden when your physical ability or doesn't allow that, or your age doesn't allow that, like, I think for women, that's just one more adjustment. We've been used to adjusting this whole time, and so it's one more adjustment. Not that it doesn't evoke any feelings, but I think it's much more impactful for men. And like you told me, you said, Jody, this is why my friends and I are all going and getting guns. It helps us feel more secure and like we can protect. And I was like, wow. And then when you said you didn't even grow up with guns, because I grew up with guns. Guns were in the house. I'm a gun. I got guns. But so someone who didn't grow up with guns even felt moved to go get a gun just to have that sense of safety, because being vulnerable, if I'm hearing it right, is more of a new experience. Not that you've never been vulnerable, but you didn't have to on the daily.
Right.
Where women, you have to on the daily be aware of your surroundings, just walk into a parking lot, and if you have a person with a disability, like you said, you have to be aware because, yeah.
And that brings up just a crazy point, but I parked the car in a walking lot at the airport. But before I did that, I asked Terry, because she'd done it before, because I'm getting in late when I fly back. And I said, is that a safe walk?
Yeah.
Now, I would have never worried about whether that, of course it was a safe walk.
Right.
Anywhere John walked was a safe walk.
Let him try.
Yeah.
So, but that vulnerability is a piece of it. But you and I have had this conversation too. The adjustments. I don't want to have to adjust.
Right.
I've never had to adjust,
right,
particularly. And so it irritates me when I pack and have to put all this stuff, and I have to think about it. And I'll probably even have to put it on a piece of paper sometime, because another piece of the triangles would be going, I'm mentally capable. But that's just irritating. And the hearing thing It's interesting because it's like you and I've talked. It's different pitches. I can hear you fine. You're a little tougher,
Okay.
and younger kids, Maceo, grandkids, that things. It's very difficult. And what was that? Can you say that louder, please? And I'm very open about it when I go into I will tell people I cannot hear.
Yeah.
So I'm because I think what I'm doing is saying I cannot hear. You need to adjust to me.
Mm.
And I never really thought about that till this very instant. But maybe that's what that's about. I don't know. I have to think about
Audience
that.
members, think about that.
That's
So
good.
being normalized dominant, now that you're not, you come in and see, and I thought that was impressive. You would come in to social settings we've been at, and you would just tell people, "Look, I can't hear," you know.
In
But
my mind, it's always been a courtesy, but now
also
I'm kind of going. You brought up the adjustment thing. It might be, please talk a little louder.
yeah, I want you to be aware that you might have to adjust to me.
Yeah, but I do watch where I sit at tables. I try to sit, and Terry
Yeah.
helps me do that. We try to sit in the middle of a
Wow.
table.
Yeah.
And restaurants are very difficult, so I try to avoid
Yeah.
exterior noise coming from behind me because hearing aids pick it
Yeah.
up from behind me. So, but I don't like it.
John, this is so interesting because we're showing up different when it comes to the hearing loss. And audience members, how much of it is just personality style difference? How much of it is living in a societal system where we held different identities, so we were sent different messages,
Sure.
but how much of that, like you said, you reflect on, hey, I realize I tell people, and then kind of expecting them to adjust to you or give you a little leeway. Yeah.
I don't like how that sounds, but yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah,
That's
okay.
okay. That's okay. But yeah, no, I never thought of it. But yeah,
Yeah,
maybe.
yeah. And the other ways that normalized dominant, your normalized dominant triangles, now you have identities that aren't normalized dominant. What are other examples of how that has affected you and shows, and then now you see people perceiving you differently as well?
Yeah. Well, like I said, I think I had three, and we talked about the aging, and we talked about the able-bodiedness. The other one was the employment issue of being retired.
Yes.
And that was harder than I thought it was going to be. When I retired, you get excited and you're going to have time, but then you find out people don't. I'm not being listened to,
Right.
or heard. I think I'm trying to put that language, but I felt this emptiness feeling, and this helps me explain why. Maybe.
Yeah.
So after I retired from the educational world, and then there was so you're looking for something because your identity is kind of gone.
Right.
For me, I felt that way, and so I was looking for. I think there was a mentoring program, so I did that for a year. So I would dabble with stuff.
Yes.
And then ended up doing some consulting, and then the hearing kind of took that out. But by the time it got there, and I just quit the consulting thing this past 6 months, and I really believe at that time I was ready.
Yeah.
I'm really ready to just step down. And I love to read, and I'm finding other things. I guess what it is, I needed more time to find a different identity. And I needed to step away and get comfortable with not being in control, so to speak, or being heard, I think was the language you and I have talked about.
Yeah.
And so that took a lot longer than I thought it was. It wasn't like, oh yeah, retirement's just wonderful.
Right.
Does that make
Oh,
sense?
that makes so. I mean, I haven't experienced it, but I experience audience members when I do trainings for communities that'll say, hey, with this employment triangle, I'm retired. Where do I put it? And I said, yeah, we have that conversation. And if you have a retirement that brings in the finances where you can continue to kind of be seen and heard, I'll say circle the normalized dominant, but and people who are retired go, yeah, but I don't get seen like I used to. Or they talk about, and so audience members, if we're retiring or our loved ones who are retiring, this is an adjustment because how much of our identity is in our job? And if we have a job that's a power position, then the loss of that is not only a loss of identity, but a loss of power and being seen and heard. And that's a huge adjustment. Now, those of you watching us right now, I just want to let you know that I did not harm Nita, nor did she walk off. Because they're just like,
I didn't
wait,
offend her.
yeah. John didn't offend her. Yeah, Nita had another event that she had to go to because Nita is always rocking and rolling. But if you're watching us, you'll see an empty seat there, and I just want you to know everything's good, right? And if you're listening to us, that's why you won't hear Nita at the end of this episode.
Right.
But I think about that retirement piece because I didn't realize, if you would say to me, "Oh, your career is your identity," because I steer away from that so much. When people ask what I do, I stay aloof about it. I don't like to talk about that I have written books or that I do that. And that's why even doing this podcast, people have been saying I should do it for a long time, or I should be out on my social media more. I don't like that. I don't like any like that. What I do isn't who I am, is what I would say. So what I do isn't who I am. But then I realized how much what I do does give me identity and sense of self, and how much I'm listened to. And just traveling, because I travel for a living, I often get bumped up, or I often get this elite status. And there was a year I didn't get it, which I know this sounds so petty, but it is, let's be honest, it is. But it's like, oh, I had that adjustment of, oh, what do you mean you don't have this ready for me? What do you mean I don't get to go first? What do you mean that adjustment wasn't there? And then I'm like, oh my gosh, I've become accustomed to it, to the point that I almost expect it. And then when it's not there, I have to adjust. And anyone else who didn't grow up with it, they're just like, okay, you're looking really spoiled right now,
Right.
But what, and this is at a much bigger scale. This is an identity, but it helps me understand, like yourself, when you have this identity your whole life and you're seen and heard, and there's certain experiences you just expect to have, and now they're not there.
Right.
How that will be how that affects you mentally, emotionally, and then how the choices that we make, like you said, getting a gun, and being what could be perceived as angry, but you're more angry because you have to make the adjustment on the pickleball court. You're not just angry in general.
Yeah.
And yet, if I don't take time to understand that, I'm not proud, audience members, but I've done what we all do, is I look at John from my perception, and I could easily be like, oh my gosh, old white cranky guy, and be judgmental and move on. But what I lose is the opportunity to build my capacity. So I always thank you, because you always engage in rich conversations that help me gain understanding. And now I show up very differently with people who are older than me. And I've talked to my mom about it. She's in her 80s, and I was surprised how aware she was. I'm like, Mom, what is it like to get older? And she's like, well, have you never noticed? Because I'll take her traveling with me. She goes, they always look at you. She goes, even if I'm in the front of the line to check into the hotel, they'll look behind me and to you. When we go out to eat, they'll look to you to pay for it. They'll even look to you when I order sometimes. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's so true. And then she did know, she was, the only thing she was, I do like is people hold the doors more for me, because she's got gray. She's like, she was, after the pandemic, I'm not dyeing my hair. Once I went gray, she goes, now it feels like I get a little bit more respect because people hold the doors and they're a little more courteous. But she said, then sometimes the courteous is almost, pandering, like talking too slow to me, and so now she's giving me that awareness. So now I watch, and she is so right. People are always making eye contact with me for the check or for the decision. They're not looking at her, even if she's the first in line or the first to speak. So those subtle ways that she's being told she's not seen are important anymore.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, I'm so excited I got that to look forward to.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. So the triangle only continues to get.
Yeah, it's an adjustment, and and you were talking about the consulting thing, and I just have to say, there's a rush when you're up in front of a group of people, and because you feel that respect when they're watching you and you're talking to them, and then at the end of it, oh, Jody, what a great job you did.
See, and that. Oh, see, there's another thing. No.
It doesn't.
No,
oh man,
when I present, I'm doing what I'm very good at, and I love that. Like, I love, like, give me an audience. I love it, but it's not for what they can do. Like, I am the one that goes off stage, and I don't care about the applause, or I am the most uncomfortable with all that.
Isn't there a rush while you're doing it?
But the rush isn't from the rush for me. If it is that, can I is the challenge. I think anyone who loves their career is
Sure.
can I create a space that you've mentioned before that's safe enough that people can start to have rich conversations.
Right.
And the more emotion in the room and the more things going on, the more I have to work, so can I get people to start to see their experience and be willing to listen to others? If that can happen, that's my rush, because it's like, okay, we
Yeah.
got people talking.
And I think you've better
But
defined it for me too. It's that
yeah.
ability to having to think on your feet and help meet people's needs to meet an objective that
Yeah.
they've asked you to take
Yeah.
them to.
Yep.
And so that's more it. I think that's
But-
probably a better way to say it.
But I've had this with another colleague, because he too also really disliked having acknowledgement and processing where that came from. And so he does a great job of, when people clap for him, saying thank you, and I will take that energy that you're giving me and bring it into my next work.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that is so honoring, rather than trying to diminish it or ignore it. So that piece, but again, audience, as you hear us talk, how much of this again is personality and other things, but how much is identity? Because when you were talking about being a man, one of the things audience members know is I was a tomboy growing up, and I was out in the rural, and I was always extremely strong because I was always working in the field, and I always took great pride in that. And so when I got older and I started to have friends who were girls, I didn't often relate to their experience. I related much more to men. And I worked construction. I worked in the chicken barn. So I was a male dominated at a young age that I was around. And so when females were afraid, or they'd be like, oh, well, I should call somebody to walk to my car, I never thought that. I'm like, bring it. You better bring it. And you better have 2 of your cousins bring it with, if you think you're going to stand a chance with me. So I didn't have that. But I always, when I went to classes to understand, hey, what's the identity of being a female in the societal system where that's not normalized dominant? And I really started to process it. I'm like, oh my gosh, I've always been so proud of being strong. Like, if you said, what's one of the things you like about yourself? Well, I'm very strong, and I'm, very capable that way, which gets into able body. I think if we would have grown, that is in response to hearing the messages that I shouldn't have been, if that makes sense. Like, I wouldn't have the pride that I have in being strong if growing up in a societal system, we were constantly saying boys and girls are equally strong. And there weren't all those little messages saying that men should be stronger. And that subtle message under that with men should be stronger is that they should be the protector then. Which is like what you said, when you couldn't protect your house, how, all of a sudden a guy who doesn't get a gun wants to get a gun. And it's like, oh my gosh. So me having this pride in my physical strength, I think actually a lot of it is a result of living in a normalized dominant societal system that says I shouldn't be that strong, and counteracting that piece.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, the message that we're sent. And so I wonder, like when the hearing aid, that I qualify, how much of that is my fear of giving, seeing that triangle start to turn, or re-looking at that
Right.
those things would be lost.
Right.
So John, what are the things you want to tell people to be aware of and now we're talking specifically when you have a normalized dominant identity and it goes to a non-normalized. I want listeners to know that it's different if you grow up with a non-normalized one, like I'm informally educated and now I'm formally educated. That's a different set of experiences. So we're specifically talking, hey, you're born with a normalized dominant identity, but it changes. What are the things that, as you look back, that you want to make sure audience members hear?
That's a great question. I think the first thing is that if you live long enough, it's going to happen.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some like the age one at 65, you kind of move in that direction. It flips for you.
Now, if you're like me and you're in your 50s, we're all going la 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 la.
Yeah. But you want to live long enough for that to happen.
Yeah, you do.
I
Right.
mean,
Yeah. The alternative.
My dad just said the alternative's not good.
Right.
So you just recognize that it's going to happen. You're going to have feelings when it's happening, and for me, feelings of fear, vulnerability, and anger that I have to change my life. I have to adapt.
Yeah.
And so you got to know that you're going to get those feelings, and that's when you've got to say, I need to process those feelings. I need to hit the pause button, as you use that term all the time.
Yeah.
Stop, reflect, look inside. Where are those feelings coming from?
Yeah.
And then say,
I'm before you. Oh, and say what? I'm sorry.
go ahead.
Oh, because I want listeners to know in case they've joined us later. Season 1, episode 5, we did an entire episode on how do we process our feelings. Because if we become more aware, feelings come up. If we don't want to, like you said, just coast or just, have selective seeing and hearing, if we want to start to really become more aware of us and understand others, it evokes feelings. And so how do we process those feelings? There's one of my favorite tools is in season 1, episode 5. Hit that because that's a great reminder of how to process these feelings that come up. So so I hear you saying recognize that it's going to happen. And that is even hard for me to hear because I'm in my 50s and I'm like, no, it's not going to happen. But yeah. And then that it's going to bring up feelings.
Yeah.
I mean, when there's a change, and that if you're going from normalized, I think that's so poignant, to be not normalized dominant, you're going to have to adjust and adapt and be vulnerable. And that's something that if you're normalized dominant, you often didn't have to do because the system was geared towards you. So becoming aware and adjusting, like you said, that brings up for you some anger, some fear. And so processing that. And then what do we do?
Well, and then you turn it in. If you can internalize and hit that pause and reflect and make it part, then it becomes a learning experience. Don't look at it as an issue. Look at it as a learning experience that will help you understand that there are people who have had to adapt and adjust their entire lives. And that feeling of vulnerability and anger are just as real for them as it is for you. Experience it now, maybe for the first time, but let that broaden and be, in our other episode, we talk about adding lenses that will help you see better from all perspectives instead of just one, which gives you a truer sense of reality.
Yeah.
You've brought those pieces closer together. Let this be a learning experience. And so maybe, I'm sure you're still going to be angry. I'm sure I'm still going to be angry. But if I can capture that and saying, wow, this is kind of an interesting creator's message to you of what it feels like to have to adapt and be vulnerable. And so you can see it in a bigger place.
And then I hear you saying with that now lived experience of adjusting, use that lived experience to better understand how other people may have been living their whole life.
Exactly.
And that gets back to that example for audience members. I told John I had this happen in my audience once because John and I are friends, and when he went through this whole thing about someone showed up to their house, there was a threat, we had processed it, and he helped me understand how that evoked fear and anger for you and that you were getting a gun. And shortly after that, I was presenting, and there was an older gentleman that was sitting next to a young girl. She was a woman. She was in her early 20s. And the older gentleman had said, talked about that fear of, I can't do what I used to. And he was angry. And I'm like, oh my gosh, my friend John just was telling me about this. And I'm starting to look at this so much different. I said, sir, talk to me more. Like I am finally getting a better understanding. And just me saying that, you could see he exhaled. Like I didn't react to him. I didn't combat him. I didn't say, oh, it's not that bad, which I absolutely might have done. Like before we had a conversation, I would have been maybe in the back of my head thinking, oh my gosh, brother, get over yourself, and I wouldn't have, but I was like, when he said that, I was like, oh my gosh. So then he starts talking about everything you just said, being vulnerable. And he didn't use that word, but he was, I have to be aware. And I live in a neighborhood that's not always safe. And I've never worried about it before. I've always just puffed up my chest and I walk where I want to walk. And he goes, the other day I was going to cross the street and there was a group of young men. And he goes, I just stood there and looked at him, and you could tell like he got tears in his eyes, and he goes, and I went the other way. I went across 2 other streets so I could ignore them because I don't know that I can take care of myself anymore. I don't know that I can stay safe. The young girl has been listening this whole time, turns to him and goes, sir, it sounds to me like you're understanding what it's like to be a woman. And both him and I are like, girl, what? And she goes, I live in that same neighborhood. And as soon as I developed breasts, as soon as I developed into a female, I have been aware of those men. I have had to adjust. I have not felt safe in that neighborhood. She was to a level. I always just like, I'm going to conduct myself, but there's always an understanding that I'm not truly safe. And because both of them had awareness and they were both able to communicate it, the rest of the day they had amazing conversations. And that's what I want to thank you, John, for coming here and sharing your experience so that those of us audience members who are in the midst of having our identities change, you just left us with some great things to think about and reflect. But then those of us audience members who have parents who are going through this change, what do you want to say to us? If we're not going through it ourselves, what's the best way that we can show up and support folks who are going through it?
Oh, okay, I think that's a good question. The advice I would give people is to not react. If dad buying a gun, I'm sure my kids were a little bit, oh, what are you doing? But don't react to that.
Yeah,
Talk, pause, and help me process it, or process it with me,
right,
so that you can better understand why I feel that vulnerability, and actually help me dispense my anger a little bit to understand why I'm doing it.
And I kind of hear you saying create a safe place that you can process.
Right.
And that we can...
Yeah, don't judge me about it until you talk to me about it.
Man, audience members, wasn't that was some deep advice, because I know if you're like me, my mom's in her 80s, and a lot of times she'll do something, I just want to react and then judge, be like, did you just seriously do that, Mom? Oh my God, what are you thinking? Like, if, and that's such good advice, is that we have to hit the pause button and then create a space where she can even process, so she can become more aware.
Yeah, because sometimes I know I have the feelings, and I'm trying to stop the feelings of fear, so I purchase a taser or a gun or something that and I don't even know totally
that's what it was
that whole
about.
piece is what I'm doing.
Yeah. And that it's about this identity being flipped and this different
yeah.
experience that you're having in the societal system.
Yeah.
So audience members, how many of us could reframe this for our loved ones and talk to them about, hey, you had an identity that was normalized and you were geared towards, and now that you're not, talk to me. What is that about? How does that feel? What is it like? And so that gives people the language to start to process it.
Exactly.
So I love that. That's a major tool for us to do with our loved ones, to do on ourselves, but then also to create that space for our loved ones. Because I don't know that people often know that this is about me losing an identity. I just know I feel fear, so I'm going to get a gun.
Sure.
Yeah. John, thank you so much for being with us today, for living your journey, but being aware, being willingness to be aware, and then being willing to share it. It's so helpful for, I think, those of us who our triangles are slowly changing from normalized dominant to not normalized, but it also was so helpful for me to hear this experience so that I can show up better for people in my world who this is happening to. Because I have to admit, a lot of times I would see things that people were doing and I would judge and react. And now to show up differently for them. So I'm going to close us out, audience members. We all know I can't do what Miss Nita does, but I want to say, this is us. We're coming together, trying to have honest, real conversations with awareness and bring understanding to each other so we can build our capacity. You could have been anywhere else. You chose to be here, and for that, we thank you. Join us next time.